What's up, everybody? My name's Adam McDormand, and today we're going to talk about writing. Now, in a previous video, I mentioned that often when we bring up the topic of MLA in our classes, we're referring to one of two things. Now, one of those, and this was the topic of a previous video, was formatting a paper, how it's laid out, how you set everything up so that it looks a certain way. But the other part of that topic is the actual citation of our sources. And that basically means that whenever we borrow someone else's idea to support something that we're saying, we need to make sure that we give that person credit. And that's why we use citation. Now, there are lots of different types of citation styles that we might use. You might see APA, you might see Chicago Turabian style. There are a handful of ones that are fairly common. But for this class and most English classes, you will end up using MLA. And so that's what we're going to look at today. In previous versions of the MLA style, there were lots and lots of different formulas that you might use depending on what type of source you are pulling your information from. That means that you would likely cite a book very, very differently than you would a piece of music or a video from YouTube. In the 8th edition of the Modern Language Association Style Guide, or MLA, that has been greatly simplified. And there's really basically one formula that you would use. So I pulled up the MLA website here. What you're dealing with here are 9 core elements that make up a citation, regardless of what medium it is you're using, whether it's text, audio, video, anything. You'll use these 9 core elements. And as it says here, each entry in the list of works cited is composed of facts that are common to most works. These are the MLA core elements, and they are assembled in a very specific order, as you can see, 1 through 9. Every citation that you build for an MLA paper will use those 9 core elements in that order. However, you may not have every single one of those pieces of information, and that may not even be relevant to whatever it is that you're pulling your information from. And we'll get into a few specific examples of that here in just a minute. The other major feature of MLA in the 8th edition is the idea of containers. It says right here, the concept of containers is crucial to MLA style. When the source being documented forms part of a larger whole, the larger whole can be thought of as a container that holds the source. For an example, a short story may be contained in an anthology, like a textbook, for instance. The short story is the source, and the anthology is the container. So those are basically the two things that you need to know in order to begin working on your MLA works cited citations. Again, you have 9 core elements, and you can think of each of those 9 core elements as falling into either the text itself or the container that holds that text. Now, it is possible to have multiple containers. You could have a text that's inside of a container that's inside even a larger work. And we'll get into a few examples of that as well. And so this is what it looks like. For each works cited entry, you're going to want to have as much of this information as you can. And that's very important because you want whoever is looking at your paper, especially if that person is in charge of your grade, to be able to tell that your source is legitimate, that you've actually pulled information from a source that they can go and look at themselves. So you have to be not only as detailed as possible, but specific and accurate. So let's take a look at our first example here. I've cited my old copy of Fahrenheit 451 because of the fact that this text is an entire book. It is the container. Now, one of the caveats that I often see students fall into, especially when citing a book like this that's been printed and published multiple times in lots of different formats, is that students will try to take a shortcut. They'll go to EasyBib, BibMe, Citation Machine, any of those websites, and just type in the title of the work. And that website will pull up multiple versions of this source text, and they'll just grab the first one and chuck that into a works cited page and assume that it's correct. And often it is not. You have to be very specific about which version of the text that you're looking at. Guys, I have multiple copies of Fahrenheit 451, and I can't just pick a random citation and throw it in there. A good example of why this is important. Let's say I want to pull a line from this text and cite it. Toward the end of the book, it says, "The men lay gasping like fish laid out on the grass." That's on page 161 in this copy of the text. But in this copy of the book, that same line is at the bottom of page 143. I need to be accurate so that whoever's looking at my paper, especially if they are a professor or a teacher who's giving you a grade, they can go and check my source documents to make sure that what I'm saying is accurate. Very, very important. Don't just go to Citation Machine or EasyBib and pull a random citation for a book that you're reading, because if it's wrong, you're going to run into problems. Let's take a look at another example here. This is a citation for a short story by Ray Bradbury from the Martian Chronicles. Now you'll notice that my source text, that I put quotation marks around the short story. Always, with shorter works, use quotation marks. That's contained in the Martian Chronicles, right? An entire book, right? It's just one part of a larger whole. My text is "There Will Come Soft Rains." The container is the Martian Chronicles. Fairly simple once you grasp that concept. Another good example of how the text and container metaphor works is when you're citing music. We're not going to do that in this class, but it's a good way to at least wrap your mind around this concept. Let's say, for some reason, I decided to pull information from the song Eleanor Rigby by the Beatles. Right? That's my text, but it's contained within a larger album, right? Revolver from 1966. Great album, by the way. That's my source text. The album is the container. There could be yet another container outside of that if I'm pulling that from, let's say, Spotify. And then I would include a link so that my professor or my teacher or whoever's reading my paper could easily go and locate the place where I got that original information from. And here's an example of how that might look. Let's say I were pulling a humorous quote from a particular episode of The Office. And notice there's no author here because I'm just pulling from an episode of a television show. But my text is one episode. My container is that television series, The Office, Season 2, Episode 1 on NBC. But I got that from yet another container. It's contained within Netflix. I have to cite that, and I can even include, in this case, it's that last core element, a location for where that episode can be found. So notice how each one of those citations was basically using the same formula, but filling in different information based on what type of source we're looking at. Now, one final bit of information that I need you to grab a hold of, specific for this class. There's an optional bit of information that you can include in MLA Works Cited that I'm going to have you do every time. And that is, if you look on the fourth line here, the original date. And that's specifically for texts that have been printed and reprinted in lots of different anthologies and textbooks and collections of short stories and websites and all over the place. You want to include a date for the original release or original publication of that source. And that's especially helpful for older texts. And we'll be looking at quite a few of those throughout the course of the year. Now, I know that's a lot to grab a hold of in a very short amount of time, but it all boils down to something very simple here, as you can see on the screen. It is a very straightforward formula, and I'll help you. I will provide you most often with all of the different elements to fill out your citation. And it will just be a matter of you practicing putting those core elements together into a citation and putting that in your Works Cited page. And of course, you can always come and ask me for help if you need it. Now let's jump over to Microsoft Word and actually look at how to set that up on the paper. So I went ahead and pasted a bunch of Works Cited entries into a Works Cited section of my paper. Now, a rule that you need to know about Works Cited pages is that they need to go at the end of your paper on their own separate page. Now, there are a couple of ways I can go about doing this. I could just jump in here and hit the enter button over and over and over again until I get that onto its own page. Now, that can be a problem because what happens if I start adding new information after I put my Works Cited page in? Let's say I add in an extra paragraph. Well, look, my Works Cited page is halfway down. Right? That's not good. So then let's say I go ahead and I fix that and I've got it down on the second page like it needs to be. good. Or what can be perhaps even worse, let's say delete a paragraph because it just doesn't work in my paper for whatever reason. Well, now my Works Cited page is halfway on to the page before it. That's not good. The way to get around that and to make sure that your Works Cited page always in the right spot is to insert a page break. Now the way that you do that is go to the Layout tab, press Breaks, and then add in a page break. So now, no matter what I add into my paper, the Works Cited page will still be at the very top of the last page that I put it at. So now what we need to do is make sure that we have the Works Cited page itself formatted properly. At the top of your Works Cited page, you should have the words Works Cited, and that needs to be centered at the top of that page. So the easiest way to do that in the iPad version of Microsoft Word, put your cursor on that line, find the formatting option, tap that, and change your paragraph formatting to center. Unlike our regular body paragraphs, our Works Cited entries are not indented. Our first line needs to be flush to the left side of the paper, but every line underneath that needs to be over ½ inch. Now we call that a hanging indent, and it's pretty easy to do. You just need to highlight whatever lines you want to change. In this case, I'm selecting all of my Works Cited entries. Tap that formatting button, go down to where it says special indent, and the option you want to select here is not first line like our regular paragraphs, but hanging. And as you can see, it pushes all of the second lines over ½ inch. Now we can see where each citation starts. Now the last thing we need to do, we need to make sure that our Works Cited entries are in alphabetical order. The easiest way to do that is to select whatever line you want, highlight the whole thing, long press it, and it will allow you to move it wherever you want it. All right, and now I have 6 entries in my Works Cited page, and they are all in alphabetical order. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this video on the Works Cited page in MLA format. Until next time, guys, good luck, have fun, what a time to be alive.